The Zuckerberg Galaxy. There is a huge need and a huge opportunity to get everyone in the world connected, to give everyone a voice, and to help transform society for the future. The scale of technology and infrastructure that must be built is unprecedented, and we believe that this is the most important problem we can focus on. Mark Zuckerberg. Facebook didn't invent social media, but it has become iconic in its acceptance and usage. While often being joked about as a scourge, near the end of 2014, more than 1.35 billion people logged on at least once per month. That surpasses the population of China, and it continues to grow. As much as the mainstream celebrates social media, even attempting to posture it as the tool of liberation during the Arab Spring, though ironically demonizing it when it was used in the same way in the Ferguson uprisings of 2014 and beyond, our sense of how radical this change in form really is becomes lost. Marshall McLuhan famously made the case that the Gutenberg technology, the printing press, had made universal change in the way its users and consumers saw the world. This pattern, beginning with the written word, cannot be overstated. Yet it is so often lost within civilization because everything we know is taught through the lens of symbolic culture, the internalized whispers of domesticators reinforcing our own perceived split from the wild world and necessary dependency on masters. This is how domestication works. But the purpose of technology is to update form and context. And as McLuhan famously observed, form dictates function. The medium is the message. So his words for the impact of the printed word hold equally true for the updated technology. When a technology is introduced, if it gives new stress or ascendancy to one or another of our senses, the ratio among all of our senses is altered. We no longer feel the same, nor do our eyes and ears and other sense remain the same. Technology flattens our world by reducing our reliance on senses while overstimulating particular sensory input. Our brains are, to put it simply, overworked and underwhelmed. Mediation and representation as evidenced by blogs, YouTube channels, Facebook feeds, and Twitter handles. This is the form. This is the form that creates a world filled with crushing depression, alienation, suffering, and anxiety. A National Center for Health Statistics study found that by 2008, the usage of antidepressants in the U.S. had gone up 400% over the previous decade across all demographics. The iPhone was released in 2007. The researchers' period of study from 2005 to 2008 saw an increase of Facebook users from 5.5 million to 100 million. That is an increase of over 1,700%. And this isn't even touching on the horrid and dire social and ecological consequences across the world. The point isn't to say that Facebook caused these things, but along with all other facets of the social network, both past, present, and future, it exacerbates them. It amplifies on exponential terms. The content and platforms drive each other, but they always have. Hyper-internalized and portable technology is the form. Domestication is the function. As the domesticators developed technology to employ their will, the ability to make change with intentionality arose. No longer was power in the scythe and the stored grains. The agrarian curse of drudgery and toil for the perceived payoff in the heavens paved the way, literally, to updated industrial forms. And the mythos evolved. Collective consciousness was slowly channeled into individual consumerism. It is no surprise that the overstressed working class in early industrializing nations thought their liberation lied within possessing the machine collectively, nor is it surprising that the antidote to that notion was selling individual heavens on an increasingly closer horizon. Progress remains. Mythos adapt. Technology increasingly spread from the means to the purpose itself. The time clock led to the pocket watch, to the wristwatch, and now to the cell phone. We embrace the objects that confine our minds to think on an artificial sense of place and self. Our world becomes both larger and smaller, so we turn to the machine, to this bartered identity. Even in a sea of flux, the technology itself increasingly becomes the constant. It becomes the savior. Chellis Glendinning called this process by what it is: techno-addiction. In such a society, people have historically become obsessed with anything that helps them to cope with the trauma of it all. We buy to know we're alive, and increasingly, we tweet to remind everyone that we're still here. Facebook's creator, Mark Zuckerberg, saw the writing on the wall. He didn't just sell it, he bought it. His rise from a computer programmer at Harvard up to the richest 20 people in the world is sadly well documented and pathetically emulated. While not coming up from the bottom of the social ladder, his story is more of an emotional rags-to-riches triumph. The reader can relate. A teenager in the 90s, a product of great technological change and raised in an atmosphere where play went from being outside with friends to inside and playing video games. Or, in Zuckerberg's case, programming them. This story is drenched in the turmoil of responding to adolescence through increasingly mediated means. The starting point for what would become Facebook was a site that rated other students by their looks. It should not be surprising that the origin point of Facebook is driven equally by a bully's entitlement and an unrelenting sense of insecurity. And that is the tone that carried on. Facebook didn't arise in a vacuum. This is hardly even history at this point. We're talking about websites that increasingly dominated the social atmosphere over the past decade. It's hardly necessary for me to recant them. What is important here is how and why Facebook took off. The obnoxiously entitled blogosphere matched with former Facebook contender MySpace both served as necessary steps towards what social networking would become. The blogs were driven by an attempt at a, and I'm biting my tongue here, grassroots sense of giving voices and reporting. Often centered around contemporary topics, their necessary role was less in what was being said, but littering the fairy tale notion of the internet as an information superhighway with opinions equally weighed with actual reporting and research. A huge part of the lucrative search engine optimization field existing relied on the hopes for bloggers to have their posts on a subject get the highest ranked search results in Google or whatever else is currently being used. Blogs quickly became an accepted resource. The internet is, after all, marketing. A blog is a brand for an individual, a public face, a personalization of a perspective that transfers the subject from content to provider. This is the cult of personality moving from the television, books, politicians, and newspapers to overly excitable and entertaining personalities. These people were enthralling because they could be you, the spectator. This was a move driven home even further via YouTube not long after. MySpace was the place to market the self under the guise of a place to keep in touch with friends, a place to sell the image of yourself that you wished to portray. Echoed along the lines of Twitter, where irrelevant quips of 140 characters and an increasingly entangled, oversharing yet selective web, the social network became accepted enough that the nearly stalker-esque Facebook was ready to take its place. The idea of posting your quips and selling yourself was worthless unless it was the main feature, the news feed. This is a sea of words projected onto a constantly shifting wall as if it was news. From the hyper-personal to the irrelevant, it's laid out flatly for your selected audience. And there are no mistakes here. These moves are intentional. They are marketing. Sold as a supplement to the life anyone wants to live, they have become the main course. And they become the platform for broadcasting the life you want others to see. Far from being a tight-knit group of friends, social networking sites, as Josie Van Dyke states in her critical history, forge personal, professional, or geographical connections and encourage weak ties. This is that urge that we all have within us, the need for community. It is your inner hunter-gatherer and their band associations. An impulse redirected for a reality supplanted. We spread ourselves widely. We feel that having information about others is as good as having actual relationships with them. And every time we log on, we are selling ourselves. The grotesque level of acceptance of the social network is apparent in how Zuckerberg basks in it. Think about what people are doing on Facebook today. They're keeping up with their friends and family, but they're also building an image and identity for themselves, which in a sense is their brand. They're connecting with the audience that they want to connect to. And to always end on a high note, it's almost a disadvantage if you're not on it now. We buy this reality because we sell it. If you want to take part in this society, if you want to stay connected with friends and family, both close and distant, here is the platform. Here is the place to do it. It almost seems ridiculous to give this platform such intense scrutiny. In the timeline of civilization, it won't even be a fragment of a blip. But the spread, grasp, and ramifications of Facebook, its intentional and unspoken uses, are monumental. You simply cannot escape them. It's not as simple as deactivating an account. It was years before deleting was even an option. These have become the terms, the grounding on which this late stage of modernity stands. The narrative of progress hardly needs to sell a distant future. It has created an eternal present, and in doing so has removed the presence. It removes the essence of being human. This is change. This is change at a rate and depth that is unprecedented even in the nasty, short, and brutish history of civilization. Amongst all of the critiques of technology, this is something that was predicted in dystopian terms, but the reality is far scarier, and by the time most of us noticed its effectiveness, we are at a loss for outlets and terms to even discuss this ongoing and worsening epidemic. The newsfeed ticks. Against the backdrop of a 24-hour news cycle, it is a fitting backdrop. The techno-addicted need constant stimulation. Going outside hardly cuts it unless it's for taking selfies or a necessary part of the sale for the projected self. The self, driven by hyper-individualistic consumerism, takes a form and precedence that could make even the most rampant egoist blush. This isn't just posturing, it's an attachment to a projected and widely cast image. An online persona is increasingly less foreign to our sense of identity. McLuhan was hardly off base when he claimed, "Schizophrenia may be a necessary consequence of literacy. In the digital age, schizophrenia may very well be a prerequisite." It's hardly surprising that cyberbullying has become such a massive issue. The bully and bullying are no longer physically confined to a physical place, and the amount of information and sources of self-doubt of the victim are broadcast far more widely. And these are the terms on which marketers and programmers think. The social network is the place where they act.